My name is Ashley Gerhardt, and I'm here to speak with you today about some research examining whether or not an addictive process plays a role in eating-related problems. I come to you from the University of Michigan in the United States, where I'm an assistant professor of clinical psychology. How did this whole area get started? How did we even start to think that something like addiction might be playing a role in obesity? Well, it first started by us seeing that individuals who are obese exhibited a lot of behaviors that we see in addiction, and an inability to cut down or abstain from certain sorts of food, a tendency to relapse back to old eating behavior patterns even once they lost weight, experiences of craving, periods where emotion dysregulation led to overconsumption of food. But this led to some problems. We have a tendency sometimes to talk about obesity as if it is food addiction. And we think that there's a lot of problems with that. It seems likely that there's a lot of people who have a higher body mass index who don't show an addictive-like response to food. There's also probably people that are exhibiting an addictive-like behavior with food, but it's not showing up in their body weight through compensatory behaviors like dieting, fasting, purging, or one of the lucky few with a very high metabolism. Some of my research has been looking into how do we identify those people that are most likely to be experiencing an addictive response to food. And to do that, I developed a measure called the Yale Food Addiction Scale. This measure takes the same diagnostic criteria we use to identify other sorts of addictions and applies it to eating-related behavior. That way, we're not relying solely on body weight to identify people who might be addictive eaters, but rather the same behavioral criteria we use for any other addiction. This provides us with an important starting point so we can look at whether there are behavioral, cognitive, and biological markers of addiction that might be showing up in this group of addictive-like eaters. Some of the work that I've done has looked at brain responses. In this situation, we looked at whether individuals having more addictive-like eating showed greater response to reward regions in the brain when they see palatable food cues. For example, in this study, we were looking at a chocolate milkshake. And we found that those people who endorsed more addictive-like eating showed greater responses in the brain that are associated with reward, craving, and desire when they saw the milkshake cue compared to other sorts of cues. Importantly, in addition to being more reactive to the cues, this group of addictive-like eaters also showed less of an inhibitory response in the brain when they were consuming the chocolate milkshake. This suggests that this group of people is very reactive to cues in the environment that suggest that these foods are available. And when they start consuming them, the circuitry that allows us to apply the brakes and stop may not be working as well. This is a parallel finding to what we see in other sorts of addictive behaviors, and again suggests that potentially an addictive process might be playing a role in problematic eating for some individuals. Just focusing on the people that might be addicted to food is only half of the story. One area of research that we haven't looked at enough is trying to understand what foods might be addictive and what active ingredients within foods might be most likely to trigger an addictive-like process. What I'm showing you here is a graph from people who filled out our food addiction scale. At the end, we asked them about a number of foods and asked them to indicate which ones they were thinking of when they were filling out the measure. As you can see, the usual suspects are at the top of the list: ice cream, chocolate, cookies, and candy. Foods that are highly processed and highly palatable. What's important about these foods is that they're very different than the foods that occur naturally, that our brain evolved to really handle. One question that I always think is interesting is trying to identify foods that are naturally occurring, that aren't processed, that have both fat and sugar in them. Take a moment, see if you can think of any. We find that fruits are high in sugar, but they really don't have much fat. We find that foods that are high in fat naturally, like nuts or some sorts of meats, really don't have sugar. So the fact that many of the foods that we're eating today are high in both fat and sugar, in addition to caffeine, salt, flavor enhancers, and lots of other ingredients to make them as palatable as possible, is really something that our brain, biology, and psychology is just adapting and getting accustomed to. And so our question is, have these foods become so rewarding and so palatable and hedonic, that they're capable of starting to trigger what looks like an addictive-like response, not just in those individuals who are addicted, but subclinical addictive-like responses in most of us who live in a Western diet. Finally, the next area of research that we're looking into is food addiction in kids. We know with other sorts of addictive substances, children are more vulnerable. Their brains are not fully developed yet, and they're psychologically not quite as advanced with different coping strategies. So if kids start smoking or drinking at a younger age, they're much more likely to have problems over the course of their development and into adulthood. What we're trying to understand is whether something similar might be going on when it comes to these really highly palatable foods in our environment and children. Children in the US see about 6,000 food advertisements every single year, and most of these ads are for highly processed, highly palatable, highly caloric foods. If these foods are capable of triggering an addictive-like response, kids might be more likely to show this than adults. And if so, if especially vulnerable children are experiencing this might last them for the rest of their life. This is an important area of study. There's been very few research studies on this, but we've recently developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale for children, so we can start to explore whether or not this is a valid concept for our kids and adolescents. Thank you so much for listening to me today.